History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8, The Latest Age. Chapter 2, A New World Order. Africa. In 1957, Ghana had been the first ex colonial new nation to emerge in the sub Saharan Africa. As Africans shook off colonialism, their problems quickly surfaced. Over the next 27 years, 12 wars were to be fought in Africa and 13 heads of state would be assassinated. There were two especially bad outbreaks of strife. In the former Belgian Congo, an attempt by the mineral rich region of Katanga to break away provoked a civil war in which rival Soviet and American influences quickly became entangled, while the United Nations strove to restore peace. Then, at the end of the 1960s, came an even more distressing episode, a civil war in Nigeria, hitherto one of the most stable and promising of the new African states. This too drew non Africans to dabble in the bloodbath. One reason was that Nigeria had joined the ranks of the oil producers. In other countries, there were less bloody but still fierce struggles between factions, regions, and tribes, which distracted the small westernized elites of politicians and encouraged them to abandon democratic and liberal principles, much talked of in the heady days when a colonial system was in retreat. In many of the new nations, the need, real or imaginary, to prevent disintegration, suppress open dissent, and strengthen central authority had led and by the 1970s to one party authoritarian government or to exercise of political authority by soldiers. It was not unlike the history of the new nations of South America after the wars of liberation. Often, opposition to the National Party had emerged in the run up to independence in a particular country that would be stigmatized as treason once independence was achieved. Nor did the surviving regimes of an older independent Africa escape. Impatience with an ancient regime, seemingly incapable of providing peaceful political and social change, led in 1974 to revolution in Ethiopia. The setting aside of the Lion of Judah was almost incidentally the end of the oldest Christian monarchy in the world and of a line of kings supposed in one version of the story to run back to the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. A year later, the soldiers who had taken power seemed just as discredited as their predecessors. From similar changes elsewhere in Africa, there sometimes emerged tyrant like political leaders who reminded Europeans of earlier dictators, but this comparison may be misleading. Africanists have generally suggested that many of the strong men of the new nations can be seen as inheritors of the mantle of pre colonial African kingship rather than in Western terms. Some were simply bandits, however. Their own troubles did not diminish the frequent irritation with which many Africans reacted to the outside world. Some of the roots of this may not lie very deep. The mythological drama built on the old European slave trade, which Africans were encouraged to see as a supreme example of racial exploitation, had been a European and North American creation. A sense of political inferiority, too, lay near the surface in the continent of relatively powerless states, some with populations less than a million. In political and military terms, a disunited Africa could not expect to have much weight in international affairs, although attempts were made to overcome the weakness that arose from division. One abortive example was that of 1958 to found a United States of Africa. It opened an era of alliances, partial unions, and essays in federation, which culminated in the emergence in 1963 of the Organization for African Unity. largely thanks to the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie. Politically, though, the Organization for African Unity has little success, although in 1975 it concluded a beneficial trade negotiation with Europe in defense of African producers. The very disappointment of much of the early political history of independent Africa directed thoughtful politicians towards cooperation in economic development, above all in relation to Europe, whose former colonial powers remained Africa's most important source of capital, skill, and counsel. But the economic record of Black Africa had been dreadful. In 1960, fruit production was still roughly kept pace with population growth. But by 1982, in all but 7 of the 39 sub Saharan countries, it was lower per head than it had been in 1970. Corruption, misconceived policies, and preoccupation with showy prestige, investment projects squandered economic aid from the developed world. Even in 1965, the GNP of the entire continent had been less than that of Illinois, and in more than half of the African countries, manufacturing output went down in the 1980s. On these feeble economies, there had fallen first the blow of the oil crisis of the early 1970s and then the trade recession that followed. The shattering effects for Africa were made even worse soon after by the onset of repeated drought. In 1960, Africa's GNP had been growing at the unexciting but still positive annual rate of about 1.6%. The trend soon turned downwards and in the first half of the 1980s was falling at the rate of 1.7% a year. It hardly seems a surprise that in 1983, the UN Economic Commission for Africa already described the picture of the continent's economy emerging from the historical trends as almost a nightmare. Unsurprisingly, political cynicism flourished, and many of the leaders of the independence era seemed to lose their way. Too many of them showed an almost complete lack of self criticism and often a frustration expressed in the encouragement of new resentments, sometimes exasperated by external attempts to entangle Africans in the Cold War. These could be disappointing too. Marxist revolution had little success. Paradoxically, it was only in Ethiopia, most feudally backward of independent African states, and the former Portuguese colonies, the least developed former colonial territories, that formally Marxist regimes took root. Former French and British colonies were hardly affected. Scapegoats inevitably were sought, increasingly but perhaps explicably, given the completeness and rapidity of decolonization in Africa and the geographical remoteness of much of it. They tended to be found nearby, or old ethnic differences emerged in civil war and massacre. But resentment also came to focus on the racial division of black and white in Africa itself. This was flagrant in the most powerful of African states, the Union of South Africa. The Afrikaans speaking those who by 1945 dominated that country, cherished against the British grievances that went back to the Great Trek and had been intensified by defeat in the Boers War. They had led to the progressive destruction of ties with the British Commonwealth after the First World War, a process made easier by the concentration of voters of Anglo Saxon origin in the provinces of Cape Town and Natal. The Boers were entrenched in the Transvaal and the major industrial areas as well as the rural hinterland. South Africa, it is true, entered the war in 1939 on the British side and supplied important forces to fight in it. But even then, intransigent Afrikaners as they increasingly called themselves, supported a movement favoring cooperation with the Nazis. Its leader became Prime Minister in 1948 after defeating South Africa's senior statesman Jan Smuts in a general election. As the Afrikaners had steadily engrossed power inside the Union and had built up their economic position in the industrial and financial sectors, the prospect of imposing a policy towards the black African that diverged from their deep prejudices was already inconceivable. The result was the construction of a system of separation of the races, apartheid. It systematically embodied and reinforced the legal reduction of the black African to the inferior status he occupied in Bo's ideology. Its aim was to guarantee the position of the whites in the land where industrialism and market economies had done much to break down the regulation and distribution of the growing black population by the old tribal divisions. Apartheid had some appeal on even less excusable grounds than the primitive superstitions or supposed economic necessities of the Afrikaners to the white people elsewhere in Africa. The only country where a similar balance of black and white population to that of South Africa and a similar concentration of wealth existed was southern Rhodesia, which, to the great embarrassment of the British government, seceded from the Commonwealth in 1965. The aim of the secessionists, it was feared, was to move towards a society more and more like South Africa's. The British government dithered and missed its chance. There was nothing that the black African states could do immediately about Rhodesia, and not much that the United Nations could do either, though sanctions were invoked in the form of an embargo on trade with the former colony. Many black African states ignored them, and the British government winked at the steps taken by oil companies to ensure their product reached the rebels. In one of the most shameful episodes in history of the feeble ministry, Great Britain's stock sank in the eyes of the Africans, who understandably did not see why a British government could not intervene militarily to suppress a colonial rebellion as flagrant as that of 1776. Many British reflected that it was precisely that remote precedent which made the outlook for intervention by a remote and military weak imperial sovereign discouraging. Though South Africa, the richest and strongest state in Africa and growing richer and stronger all the time, seemed secure, it was, together with Rhodesia and Portugal, the object of mountain black African anger as the 1970s began. The drawing of the racial battle lines was hardly offset by minor concessions to South Africa's blacks and its growing economic ties with some black states. There was a danger, too, that outside powers might soon be involved. In 1975, after the Portuguese withdrawal from Angola, a Marxist regime took power there. When civil war followed, foreign communist soldiers arrived from Cuba to support the government, while South African support was soon given to the rebels against it. The South African government soon showed that it could take action. It sought to detach itself from the embarrassment of association with an unyielding, independent Rhodesia, whose prospects had sharply worsened when Portuguese rule came to an end in Mozambique in 1974, and a guerrilla campaign was launched from that country against it. The American government contemplated the outcome if Rhodesia collapsed at the hands of black nationalists, depending on communist support. It applied pressure to the South Africans, who, in turn, applied it to the Rhodesians. In September 1976, the Rhodesian Prime Minister sadly told his countrymen that they had to accept the principle of black majority rule. The attempt to found an African country dominated by whites had failed. It was another landmark in the recession of European power. Yet the guerrilla war continued, worsening as black nationalists sought to achieve unconditional surrender. At last, in 1980, Rhodesia briefly returned to British rule, therefore re emerging into independence, this time as the new nation of Zimbabwe, with a black prime minister. This left South Africa alone as the sole white dominated state and the richest in the continent, and the focus of black, which in this context meant non white, resentment around the world. Although the OAU had been split by civil war in Angola, African leaders could usually find common ground against South Africa. In 1974, the General Assembly of the United Nations forbade South Africa to attend its sessions because of apartheid. And in 1977, the UN Commission of Human Rights deftly sidestepped demands for the investigation of the horrors perpetrated by blacks against blacks in Uganda, while castigating South Africa along with Israel and Chile for its alleged misdeeds. From Pretoria, the view northwards looked more and more menacing. The arrival of Cuban troops in Angola showed a new power of strategic action against South Africa by the USSR. Both that former Portuguese colony and Mozambique also provided bases for South African dissidents who fanned unrest in the black townships and sustained urban terrorism in the 1980s. These were no doubt among the reasons for changes in the position of the South African government. By the middle of that decade, the issue seemed to be no longer whether the more obnoxious features of apartheid should be dismantled, but whether black majority rule could be concealed by South African whites without armed conflict. A change was apparent when a new prime minister took office in 1978. To the dismay of many Afrikaners, P.W. Botha slowly began to unroll a policy of concession. Before long, though his initiative slowed, continuing signs of hostility to South Africa in the United Nations, urban terrorism at home, an increasingly dangerous and military demanding situation on the northern frontiers in Namibia, allocated to South Africa years before as a UN trusteeship territory. An increased distrust of Botha among his Afrikaner supporters all led him back towards repression. His last gesture to relaxation was a new constitution in 1983, which provided representation for non white South Africans in a way that outraged black political leaders by its inadequacy and disgusted white conservatives by conceding the principle of non white representation at all. Meanwhile, the pressure of what were called sanctions against South Africa by other countries were growing. In 1985, even the United States imposed them to a limited extent. By then, international confidence in the South African economy was falling and the effects were showing at home. Straws before the wind of change in domestic opinion could be discerned in the decision of the Dutch Reformed Church, to which many Afrikaners belonged, that apartheid was at least a mistake and could not, as had been claimed, be justified by scripture. There was also growing division among Afrikaner politicians. It probably helped too that in spite of its deepening isolation, South African military action successfully mastered the border threats, though it was incapable of defending the Angolan government so long as Cuban forces remained there. In 1988, Namibia came to independence on terms South Africa found satisfactory, and peace was made with Angola. This was the background against which P.W. Botha, President of the Republic, since 1984, reluctantly and grumpily stepped down in 1989 to be succeeded by F.W. de Klerk. Soon made it clear that the movement towards liberalization was to continue and would go on much further than many thought possible, even if this did not mean the end of the apartheid in all respects. Political protest and opposition were allowed much more freedom. Meetings and marches were permitted. Imprisoned black nationalist leaders were released. Meanwhile, an important change in the relations between the superpowers had produced agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union over ending the struggles in Angola and Mozambique and giving freedom to Namibia. Suddenly, the way ahead opened up dramatically. In February 1990, F.W. de Klerk announced a new South Africa. 9 days later, the symbolic figure of Nelson Mandela, leader of the African National Congress, emerged at last from jail. Before long, he was engaged in discussion with the government about what might come next. For all the firmness of his language, there were hopeful signs of a new realism that the task of reassuring the white minority about a future under a black majority must be attempted. Just such signs, of course, prompted other black politicians to greater impatience. The transition to democratic rule in South Africa was not a simple one. Even though de Klerk, acting with speed and bravery, had rescinded most of the apartheid legislation by the end of 1991, there were many among the white elites who, in various ways, resisted change. But neither the 1993 assassination of Chris Hani, a prominent left wing leader of the ANC, nor ethnic strife in the black townships, often fueled by rogue elements inside the apartheid state, could unmake the road to majority rule. Increasingly, the great majority of South Africans of all races came to view Nelson Mandela reverently, referred to by his clan name, Madiba, as the guarantor of political stability and economic progress in a new multiracial state. When he was elected president in 1994, Mandela spoke of a country reborn and a pride regained for all South Africans. But it was in the following year when President Mandela put on the jersey of all white South African national rugby team, the Springboks, to celebrate their victory in the World Cup, that he became the symbol of national unity for whites as well as blacks. Madiba magic worked for us, said the captain of the team. In 1999, as Mandela stepped down from the presidency, all of South Africa had reason to say the same. Latin America. By 1900, some Latin American countries were beginning to settle down, not only to stability but to prosperity. Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. To the original colonial implantations in the continent had been added the cultural influence of 19th century. Europe, especially of France, to which Latin American elites had been drawn in the post-colonial period. Their upper classes were highly Europeanized, and the modernity of many of the continent's great cities reflected this, as they also reflected the recent European immigration, which was beginning to swamp the old colonial elites. As for the descendants of the Aboriginal Americans, they were hardly to be taken into account. In one of the two countries, their suppression had been so complete as to produce near extinction. Almost all Latin American states were primary producers of agricultural or mineral exports. Some were relatively highly urbanized, but their manufacturing sectors were inconsiderable, and for a long time they did not seem to be troubled by the social and political problems of the 19th century Europe. Capital had flowed into the continent, only briefly and occasionally checked by financial disasters and disillusionments. the only social revolution in a Latin American state before 1914, began with the overthrow of the Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz in 1911. It opened the way to nearly 10 years of fighting and a million deaths, but the primary role was played by a middle class that felt excluded from the benefits of the regime, not by an industrial or rural proletariat, and that class was the main gainer, along with the politicians of the party which merged to monopolize power until the 1990s. Although most Latin American countries could display class conflict aplenty in their countrysides, they did not appear to suffer from the social bitterness of industrialized and urbanized Europe. These promising looking societies survived the First World War prosperously. It brought important changes in their relations with Europe and North America. Before 1914, although it was the predominant political influence in the Caribbean, the United States did not exercise much economic weight to the South. In 1914, it supplied only 17% of all foreign investment south of the Rio Grande, and Great Britain much more. The liquidation of British holdings in the Great War changed that. By 1919, the United States was the largest single foreign source of investment in South America, providing about 40% of the continent's foreign capital. Then came the world economic crisis. 1929 was the doorway to a new and unpleasant era for the Latin American states, the true beginning of their 20th century and the end of the 19th. Many defaulted on their payments to foreign investors. It became almost impossible to borrow further capital abroad. The collapse of the prosperity led to growing nationalist assertiveness, sometimes against other Latin American states, sometimes against the North Americans and Europeans. Foreign oil companies were expropriated in Mexico and Bolivia. The traditional Europeanized oligarchies were compromised by their failure to meet the problems posed by falling national incomes. From 1930 onwards, there were more military coups, rising and abortive rebellions than at any time since the Wars of Independence. The year 1939 again brought prosperity as commodity prices rose because of wartime demand. In spite of the notorious admiration of Argentina's rulers for Nazi Germany and evidence of German interests in some other republics, most of them were either sympathetic to the Allies who courted them or subservient to the United States. Most of them formally joined the United Nations side before the war ended, and one, Brazil, sent a small expeditionary force to Europe, a striking gesture. The most important effects of the war on Latin America, however, were economic. One of the great significance was that the old dependence on the United States and Europe for manufactured goods now became apparent in shortages. An intensive drive to industrialize gathered speed in several countries. On the urban workforces that industrialization had built up was founded a new form of political power that entered the lists as a competitor with the military and traditional elites in the post war era. Authoritarian, semi fascist, and popular mass movements brought to power a new kind of strong man. Perón in Argentina was the most famous, but Colombia in 1953 and Venezuela in 1954 produced similar rulers. Communism had no such conspicuous success among the masses. A significant change had also come about in the way United States used its preponderant power in the Caribbean. 20 times in the first 20 years of the century, American armed forces had intervened directly in neighboring republics, twice going so far as to establish protectorates. Between 1920 and 1939, there were only two such interventions in Honduras in 1924 and Nicaragua 2 years later. By 1936, there were no US forces anywhere in the territory of Latin America except by agreement at the Guantanamo base in Cuba. Indirect pressure also declined. In large measure, this was a sensible recognition of changed circumstances. There was nothing to be got by direct intervention in the 1930s, and President Roosevelt made a virtue of this by proclaiming a good neighbor policy that stressed non intervention by all American states in one another's affairs. With some encouragement from Washington, this opened a period of diplomatic and institutional cooperation across the continent. It succeeded in bringing an end to the bloody Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay, which raged from 1932 to 1935, and it culminated in a declaration of Latin American neutrality in 1939, which proclaimed a 300-mile neutrality zone in its waters. When in the following year a United States cruiser was sent to Montevideo to stiffen the resistance of the Uruguayan government to a feared Nazi coup, it was more evident than ever that the Monroe Doctrine and its Roosevelt policy had evolved almost silently into something more like a mutual security system.